Anyway, I'm thrilled to be here tonight, partly because Mike is doing something that's really terrific. And I've been to a number, as he mentioned, a number of these OCM conferences over the years. And OCM is really focused on competition policy and antitrust. And there's one of the things is that there's all these people, we've heard a bunch of people today talking about it, who are doing really terrific stuff, building up from the bottom, building up from the grassroots, building markets at the local level. But what Mike's trying to do is bring that effort, and that's what I guess yesterday and today were about, bring it together, and that is what OCM is really focusing on, which is, when you're growing stuff up from the bottom, you also have to chop down some big trees to let the light in so that those things can grow. And I think that's actually where the future of this country is going to be, is actually you're doing both, growing up from the bottom and chopping down some big trees. One of the things is, because of the dinner, I decided I'd start off tonight with a story of a victory by the people, rather than sort of all of the things that we have, all the obstacles, all the dangers that we face today. And I'm going to start off actually talking a little bit about architecture, about buildings. And back in 1912, this building was opened. It was called the Woolworth Building. How many of you guys have ever seen the Woolworth Building in New York? Yeah, a number of people. So the Woolworth Building was the building of that moment. It was 60 stories tall. It was the tallest building in America for 20 years until the Chrysler Building was opened. And it was a building. It was a shrine to. It was really a cathedral for commerce. It was actually. Anyone who's seen it will know that it's decorated in all this Gothic sort of emblems. It was a really quite beautiful building. If you haven't seen it, you should go see it. It's downtown. It's near Wall Street. In fact, it's kind of right next to Wall Street. It's not only a beautiful building, but it's a beautiful symbol. It's a beautiful symbol for America back in the 1890s, America back in the first decade of the 1900s. The politics of that era, the business practices of that era. And to understand that, it's kind of worth going back and looking at sort of the history of the Woolworth Company, which was the five and dime of the era. It was like kind of the Walmart of that time. It started off, Woolworth started off in 1878. This guy named Frank Winfield started one store. And he built it up into a little chain. Kind of the American dream. But then, once he had his little chain, he met up with the heads of a few other chains, and they created a syndicate. They all worked together. And then after a while, they said, let's take this syndicate, let's just merge it together. So, we're all in charge of it, have all of our companies under one roof. So it suddenly became a chain of 600 stores. Then he went to the banks. He went to Wall Street, and he got an IPO, $30 million. Huge amount of money for those guys, $30 million. So what? And then he built this building. They built this building on Wall Street. So what that building symbolized for a lot of people back in 1912 was here had been this line of business, selling general goods that had been distributed among thousands of families across America. Here had been a line of business in which all these different towns had somebody who was a member of that town, that community, who was handling the general merchandise business. And suddenly, jump ahead to 1912, and it's all monopoly. The profits from all of these activities all across America that had been in the hands of all these families, that had been left in all these communities, suddenly all of those profits are on Wall Street. You could see the power in this building. Actually, it's like the literal concentration of power. That's what people saw that building as in 1912. And people reacted against it. And that's what I want to start with, is this reaction. 1912 was the reaction. And it's really important for us today to actually, the 1912 election was one of the most important elections in this country. It's actually a model for it. But this reaction, it's like from just what people were reacting against was, going back to the beginning. going back to 1776, going back to the Tea Party in 1773, right up to the Civil War, America was a Republican nation. And that's a smaller, I don't know how you say the word Republican, smaller Republican nation. You know, what are the Republicans that era want? They want to see distribution of power. They want to see the distribution of responsibility. They want to see the distribution of opportunity. They wanted to see the citizen as sovereign over his own life. They want to see the community sovereign over what takes place within its own boundaries. You know, for many, many years, we translated these ideals into law with some simple principles. You know, we saw ourselves as having a right to open markets. We saw ourselves as having a right to compete, a right to use our minds and our labor in the ways that we alone chose. You know, Senator Sherman, this is the guy who was responsible for the original Antitrust Act. In 1890, he was defending his Antitrust Act. He said, this is a quote, this is from a speech. He goes, "It is the right of every man to work, labor, and produce in any lawful vocation, and to transport his production on equal terms and conditions. This is industrial liberty and lies at the foundation of the equality of all rights and privileges." And here, 1912, people looked around and they saw those rights, many of those rights squashed. They saw all that wealth piled up, literally piled up on Wall Street in this building. All that power concentrated in the hands of a few financiers. And the reaction, we saw that reaction in the election of 1912. And that election was different than almost any election since then, because that election really pivoted around three parties. One of the parties was the Republican Party, the classic Republican Party, the Republican Party of business as it had been after it had been captured in the late 1890s. That was, their candidate was a guy named William Howard Taft. And William Howard Taft, he kind of said, what his vision, to the extent it was a vision, was, you guys don't worry, you voters don't worry, you the big business people, we'll take care of it. It was a very feudal vision. We'll protect you from foreign threats, and we'll protect you. We'll feed you a little bit, and we'll make sure you've got maybe a roof over your head. But don't worry about it. That was this feudal vision. There's a second vision, which was kind of an odd vision at that time. It was a new vision, and that was the Bull Moose Party. Now, apparently there's a special, or there's a PBS now about the Roosevelts. And so Teddy Roosevelt is a really interesting fellow. But one of the things he never really got his competition, even though he's seen as a trust buster, he never really was so much of a trust buster. And in 1912, he was not a trust buster at all. His vision in 1912 was essentially a socialist vision, a corporatism. And what he said in the Bull Moose Party is, concentration is natural, concentration is inevitable. It's due not to law, it's due to metaphysics. It's just the way things are. So what we can do, the best thing we can do is we can take our government and we can stick it on top of these concentrations and make them work better. There was a third vision out there. It was the old Jeffersonian vision. It was the vision of distribution of power and distribution of opportunity. It was this fellow named Woodrow Wilson, who had at his back this guy named Louis Brandeis. And this is a quote from that campaign. This is from Wilson. It was the reason that America was set up was that she might be different from all the nations of the world in this, that the strong could not put the weak to the wall, that the strong could not prevent the weak from entering the race. America stands for opportunities. America stands for a free field of no favor. America stands for a government responsive to the interests of all. And then he went on. This is what Woodrow Wilson said in the campaign of 1912. To the masters of the government of the United States are the combined capitalists and manufacturers of the United States. Can you imagine Barack Obama saying that today? Even though it's true. And then he went on and goes, when I am fighting monopolistic control. I am fighting for the liberty of every person in America. And then the citizens voted. They had these three visions. They had the feudalist vision, they had the corporatist, the socialist vision, and they had the vision that was based on the old Jeffersonian ideals, the old ideals of the founders. And they chose. We chose. We chose Wilson. It was pretty overwhelming. Were it not for World War I, we in America today would probably be speaking more of the Wilsonian Revolution than of the New Deal. Right now, we kind of look back to the New Deal as the big change, the big break in politics, the most recent big break. And it was important. What Wilson did was, during his few years in power, was really important. During the first 14 months in power, they passed the Clinton Antitrust Act, which finally got antitrust to function well. The first 20 years after the Sherman Act, it was used mainly against unions, mainly against co-ops. They established the Federal Reserve to take the power away from a guy named J.P. Morgan. They took on tariffs. They built the FTC. They took on meatpackers. Then World War I got in the way. And it was a disruption of the world economy that was of first magnitude. So what that meant is that this revolution was stopped in its tracks. It really wasn't until the New Deal 20 years later that people finally finished it. And the New Deal, if you look at the New Deal, was almost all of those people were people who had served in Wilson's government. Now, right at the beginning of the New Deal, there was some of this corporatism, some of this socialism, the Teddy Roosevelt kind. That's what we hear about a lot today. But what really happened in the New Deal really began in 1935. Congress said, you know what, we're done with this socialism, we're done with this corporatism. The courts, Louis Brandeis, who was then on the Supreme Court, said, this is not the American way to go. And FDR listened. And what they did, Congress and the executive, they passed all those laws. They passed a whole suite of brand new laws. Anti-monopoly laws, there were pricing laws, things called Robinson-Patman, but basically it was all this whole suite of anti-monopoly laws. And these laws, and this is the key thing, these laws were engineered to localize commerce. It was engineered to take the power that was concentrated in a company like Woolworth and return it to a place like Colorado Springs or Boulder. They did things like they took on a company called the A&P, and they froze it into place. They didn't break it up. Well, they actually broke a piece of it off, but they just said, you're done throwing it. They took on Woolworth. They built community banks. The idea was to re-establish the traditional American economy in which each person, each family, each community is sovereign, each person and each family is free of distant foreign control by some giant corporation. And this is here's another quote. This guy, Supreme Court Justice Douglas in 1949. And this is the way people thought. When independents are swallowed up by the trusts and entrepreneurs become employees and absentee owners, the result is a serious loss of citizenship. Local leadership is diluted. He who was the leader of the village becomes dependent on outsiders for his action and his policy. That was the world that Mike grew up in. That was anyone who's like over mid-40s. That was the world we grew up in which when you went to the Main Street, there were no chains, or very few chains. Responsibility was localized. Each community was self-governing. In 1950, a fellow named Sam Walton came along. He was able to open a company called Walmart. He opened one store back in 1950. He was able to do that because the people before him had made the world safe for Sam Walton. They had taken down the A&P. They had neutralized Woolworths. So he was able to start his one store. and that was probably all he really needed to take care of his family. Let's jump ahead to today. We all know that something happened, right? That world doesn't really exist anymore. Something really big happened. It's something that's measurable. One of the ways we can measure it is to look at the heirs of Sam Walton. The heirs of Sam Walton now control as much wealth as 41.5% of all of the bottom of the American citizens. They control as much wealth as 130 million Americans. One family controls as much wealth as 130 million Americans. More than 1/3 of the population, 40% of the population. Those Woolworth buildings, all that power we saw concentrated in the Woolworth buildings, now that building is 100 times taller. But this didn't just happen when it comes to general goods. It's happening in pharmacies. You know, we see CVS and Walgreens control pretty much the entire pharmacy business in America. It's in office goods. You know, you see it in Staples. Musical instruments, you know, with the Guitar Center. Books. Amazon now controls well over 50% of their book market. And beer. Two companies control 80% of the beer that's sold in the United States. And they are now floating the idea of merging together. Anheuser-Busch, InBev, and South African breweries, which is Miller Coors. Merging together, one company, 80%. Semiconductors, car parts, chemicals, drugs, all extremely highly concentrated. Insurance, hospitals. There's a total boom in hospital mergers now. Railways, airlines. We all know how bad it is to fly airlines today. Telecommunications, broadband search. Google controls how much of the search. Advertising, Google also controls most of the advertising now. In agriculture, seeds, grain, chickens, pigs, beef. Incredibly concentrated. Now this is bad for consumers, bad for buyers, bad for us as buyers. You know, it results in lower quality, results in less choice, results in higher prices. I'll give you just one example. Vaccines. The 5 basic vaccines that any child should take in their first year. Over the past 20 years, the cost, in real terms, the cost of those 5 vaccines has gone up 5 times. What cost $200 now costs $1,000. These are the exact same vaccines that were invented 40 years ago, 50 years ago. We pay 5 times what we paid for vaccines that we use to protect our children in their first year of life. Those prices should have gone down. It should cost a lot less than $200, not 5 times. It's bad. This kind of concentration is bad for workers, bad for wages, bad for mobility. With even the Federal Reserve is now recognizing that the mobility of American workers is radically less than it was 10, 15 years ago. In Silicon Valley, this is not just little workers, not little peanuts. It's also in Silicon Valley that we found out that Google, Apple, Intel, the bosses, the CEOs, Steve Jobs, Eric Schmidt got together and they created a cartel, a labor cartel, to prevent their workers from changing companies. The liberty to say, to hell with my job, was taken away from them. They were not allowed to cross from one company to the other because of a cartel. It's bad for communities, obviously. And I'm not talking about towns, but big cities. You know, we've been looking a lot at St. Louis. You look at Cincinnati, you look at Memphis, you look at Philadelphia. All of these activities, these industrial activities, have been taken away from them. Their banks have been taken away. Their retail has been taken away. Their agriculture has been taken away. In New York even in New York now, The book industry in New York, subject to a distant power, Amazon. The entertainment industry in New York, subject to a distant power, Comcast. The advertising industry, subject to a different power, Google again. The sovereignty of these communities is being stripped away. They're being turned into the colonies of distant powers. In 1938, Franklin Roosevelt said, "The liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism. Ownership of government by an individual, by a group, or by any other controlling private power." Fascism, that was the word FDR used. He went on. "Business monopoly in America paralyzes the system of free enterprise on which it is grafted. It is fatal to those who manipulate it as to the people who suffer beneath its impositions." Today, if we are honest about our country today, we have to admit that we've seen a pretty radical loss of the vibrancy, the independence within our communities. We've seen a pretty radical loss of our liberties. One of the things that Mike knows well is what's happening in, say, chicken farming. Now, I mentioned to you about what's happening with these PhD folks over in Silicon Valley. We can see the future if we look at chicken farming. Chicken farmers in America, they get to sell into one processing plant. You might be in a valley, there might be, you maybe are selling into a Tyson's plant, maybe in the next valley there's a JBS plant. You're part of, you're not allowed to take your chickens over to that JBS plant. You're the property of Tyson's. And these companies, what they have established, and they actually call it this is called the tournament system. And they use this system to pit farmer against farmer. Yeah, it used to be. When we had open markets, if you grew chickens, you took those chickens to market, you would get X amount of dollars. Maybe say $1 a pound. That was the market price. Maybe there's a little discount if your product is a little below normal quality. Maybe you get a little premium if you're bringing some good product to the market. But $1 a pound is the price. Today, the companies will say, you know what? We're going to pay you 60 cents a pound. We're going to pay you $1.30 a pound. It's just up to the forum. There is no rhyme or reason. It is arbitrary power in America today. What we have, see if we're honest, is a radical loss of democracy. 20 years ago, we didn't see hardly anybody in charge of our press, in charge of our media. Today we see people like Rupert Murdoch, runs Fox, runs the Wall Street Journal, runs HarperCollins, and on and on and on and on. The Koch brothers, the Waltons, Bill Gates. I mean, Bill Gates, he spent $200 million to jam Common Core down our throats just because he thought he's smarter than all of them. He's got the wealth to do that. And we sit here and we allow him to tell us how to run our schools. Increasingly, each and every one of us stands naked and alone before power. As a French peon before Louis XIV. As a Roman peon before Nero. They can do with us as they wish. And if you look at the power that is being accumulated in a Google and an Amazon to discriminate against us, to discriminate among us based on what they know about us, all that information they gather about us. Well, you want to buy this book. I'm going to sell you this book for $10. You, I'm going to charge $12. You, I'm going to charge $8.99. And none of you get to compare. Tomorrow's event is an organization for competitive markets. We are at the end of markets in America. There are no markets. When you lose the marketplace, when you lose the ability to compare pricing, that's when you lose the public. The public ceases to exist. Each and every one of us stands separately, stands naked and alone, unable to compare information with our fellows. We're entering an arbitrary world, an autocratic world, a lawless world. And as FDR had warned, when you enter this kind of world, one of the things that happens is systems start to break down. So what is it that happened? It's actually what happened. This is actually going to, maybe strike you as kind of strange, but what happened is that there was a new idea was foisted upon us. That's all that happened. It's just a different idea was used to organize our political economy. It's the simplest of ideas. And the idea is efficiency. Going back to the beginning of this country, what we aimed at was checks and balances. We aimed at the distribution of power. That's what markets are. Markets are actually ways to distribute power. Markets are ways that we use to govern competition. A generation ago, people came along and said, competition is wasted. What we need is efficiency, so you can all have more stuff. It's such a simple idea. It's so innocuous sounding, efficiency. Right? We had influential supporters on the right. The Chicago School had influential supporters on the left. The socialists, people like John Kenneth Galton, Lester Thoreau. So the socialists on the left and the feudalists on the right, they came together and they said, let's get rid of this competition. Let's get rid of this whole political economy that the people voted for back in 1912. We can work together. We can figure it out. And we'll have the power. Because we'll have the corporations and we'll have the government. And if you actually look at the way the world works today, you've got a whole bunch of power concentrated in corporations, you've got a whole bunch of power concentrated in government. Where you don't have power is any power concentrated among us. This idea of efficiency continues to be the guiding principle of the land today. In our courts, in our business schools, in our law schools. Lena Kahn, who worked for me for 3 years, has wrote a number of really fantastic articles. You can find them online. She just enrolled. She's starting this month in Yale Law. She's hardly coming out with all of these horrific stories about what she's finding inside of Yale Law School. The good news, though, there is good news, is that what we do have to change is only this one thing, this one idea. We go back to that simple old idea. Checks and balances, the distribution of power, get rid of efficiency, and we remake the world that we once lived in. Now, I'm sure you're all thinking, Barry must be kind of crazy, right? It's so much harder today. Power is so much more concentrated. Even if we know what to fix, how are we ever going to get the power together to do it? This idea of efficiency is now supported by a massed array of financiers, by a massed array of corporations, by a massed array of corporate-controlled media, by a massed array of captive politicians and flunky academics. That tower of mammon on Wall Street seems to loom fantastically large. I'm going to finish tonight with two quick stories. You know, my father, some of you met actually, Joe Maxwell's met my father, Mike has met my father. He was 90 years old, just died a couple weeks ago. He went the way he wanted to go. My father taught me a lesson. I must have been about 9. He was in 4th grade. And my dad used to sell insurance. And the way he sells insurance down in Miami, where I grew up, is after dinner, maybe about 7 o'clock, you'd go over to people's houses and you'd sit on their car. And you smoke. And you talk. And one day my dad took me on one of these trips over to this other part of the neighborhood where I didn't really know the kids as well. And I recognized one of the girls, a girl I liked. Lived down, she was down the street, and I went over to talk to her. And her brother was there, he was 2 years older. He was a 6th grader, he was big. And I walked up to talk to this girl, and her brother kind of got my way and said, "What are you doing here? This is 9 years old. Get the hell out of here." He was really kind of big. I kind of shrunk up, and I kind of ambled back to that car where my dad was talking to this other guy. My dad just looked at me and said, "You're going to let him do that?" So I walked back and I said, "I'm just going to get punched. But it's better than backing down." But I didn't have to get punched. I went and I stood, puffed up my chest, and that boy he backed down. It was fine. He backed away. Didn't have to throw any punches. Now, just so you know, my dad was a punch thrower. When he was in the Navy, he got thrown in the brig many, many times. He spent about half his time in the brig from what I could tell. Other lesson, another story. There's a friend of mine, someone who some of you have met in Washington. There's a person named Zephyr Teachout. Zephyr Teachout, 3 months ago, a little more than 3 months ago, it was June 1. 3 months ago, I was on a phone call with Zephyr Teachout. And she said, she had just been through this whole process of almost being selected by the Working Families Party of New York to run against Andrew Cuomo in the primary. And then Cuomo, who was quite the vocal, he pulled all these strings. And he's got pretty much kind of direct control over the Working Families Party because their money comes from the unions. So he turns a crank, and that makes the unions feel pain. And then the unions pass that pain on to the Working Families Party. So just at this point, when they're about to name my friend Zephyr Teachout to run against Andrew Cuomo, he turned his little crank, and they turned their crank, and then the party said, "Well, you know, as much as we want to do this, we can't." The Monday after that happened, Zephyr Teachout and I and a couple, and I think there was one other person, were on the phone. We said, and she's like, "Well, should we go on? Should we just run, even without the Working Families Party?" The Working Families Party is the guy that helped to get de Blasio elected mayor in New York. So we got nothing. We got no name recognition. We got no money in the bank. Zero. And we said, "Well, what the hell? We got nothing to lose, and we got nothing to lose. So let's do it." Jump ahead to September 9th. And starting from a complete dead stop, Zephyr Teachout, with almost very, 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 very little money, she got put up 35% of the vote. She kept Andrew Cuomo down to 60% of the vote. The New Yorker called it one of the greatest embarrassments in modern politics. And this was just because we decided to fight. And that bully, he turned out to be a lot less awesome than we thought. Had we had one more month, we would have beat him. One more month is all we needed. We had 3 months, wasn't quite enough. What this means is that on our side, we got the ideas, we got the knowledge, we got the numbers, And all we need to do is the organizing. And once we do that, we'll win. But anyway, thank you.